Hello, and welcome to Jetavanaram Buddhist Monastery. Today, we meet with yet another episode of a new series of talks titled Buddha's Guide to Happiness. Over the last 6 or so episodes, I have been talking to you about my personal philosophy to achieve happiness. It is not my invention per se. It is something that I was helped to discover. And through these talks, my intention is to share that path with you. Because I believe that as much as we talk about happiness, it is something that everyone, everywhere, throughout the world, seems to be interested in and in the pursuit of. People aren't really happy and content in their lives. People all around us, including ourselves, generally speaking, are always trying to be happy, but never quite happy. But that defeats the purpose, in my opinion. Because if happiness is something we must always run after, then we are always one step behind it. In which case, it is the pursuit of happiness that keeps us unhappy. I believe you'll see the irony in that. The very thing that we are after, if it only gets us the opposite of that very thing, then that is quite ironical. Particularly when it comes to happiness. If it is our pursuit of happiness that keeps us unhappy, then what is the point of happiness? So when you look around you, in the world we live in, people do all sorts of things to be happy. People are always trying to be happy, but never quite happy. So is it something that is unachievable? Is it something that we must always strive for, but something that we will never be able to accomplish? These are questions that we must ponder. And these are questions that we must at least attempt to find answers to. Because there is one thing that is common to all of us, and that is, if we were to offer the purpose of life, after all things are considered, when everything is said and done, isn't the purpose of life the achievement of a satisfaction, fulfillment, contentment, and happiness? If that is the purpose of life itself, and we go through as many years as life offers us, but in the end, if that is the one thing that we have been unable to achieve, then what is the point of having lived in the first place? Is a question we must all ask ourselves. But why wait till it's too late? This may be a question that people ask of themselves towards the latter part of their lives. Right at the end of their lives, as they turn the last few pages of the book of life, nearing the words "the end," this may be a question that people are forced to find an answer to, an answer that they can be content with. Because it is very unsettling, and it would be, quite obviously, and quite understandably, it would be very unsettling if at the end of 70, 80, 90, or even 100 years of life, if you were to ask yourself the question, was it worth having lived this long a life? If the purpose of it was to achieve happiness, and yet throughout these years I have done everything under the sun, everything I could possibly imagine to achieve it, but alas, today I have reached the end without having achieved it. That is not something I would want for myself, and it certainly isn't something I would want for you or anyone. But unfortunately, it is something that we see all the time. Having gone through life, at least 30 or so years of it, and having worked in many a profession, having been exposed to people of all walks of life, at all ages, men, women, children, something that I have seen is unfortunately common, and that is virtually everyone at the end of their life wish that life were a tad bit different, that life treated them just a little bit different. They wish that life turned out to be a little bit different. In other words, what they're saying is, if only I could have achieved what I wanted to achieve, then my life would have been purposeful. But then, of course, it's too late to change anything. And that is why we bring to you these talks, so that you don't regret at the end of this project that is life, a project of limited time, as all projects are, something that has a start and an end date, something that has an objective. And if that objective is the achievement of happiness, and you are given a limited amount of time within which to achieve that, I don't want any of you to regret. I certainly don't want it for myself. And on my quest to break free from this conundrum, I have come to realize that there is only one path to achieving that unconditional happiness. The purpose of these talks is to bring that to you step by step, to share that with you, my experience of having traversed this journey. I'm still on it. I haven't quite completed it yet. I'll be the first to admit that. But I see light at the end of this tunnel. And I want you to come along with me. I'd like to share this with you so that you have available to you yet another option, another avenue to consider as you take the next step in life. So, last week, we made a segue into understanding the workings of pleasure, what pleasure is really all about, and how we can possibly try and define it, and even how we could try and measure it. I'd like to continue from where we left off last week. Before we do that, let us take a moment to pay our veneration to the Lord Buddha, the Supremely Enlightened One, and continue with our discussion. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Those of you who joined us last week will, I'm sure, remember that we discussed this concept of beauty to some extent. Why did we discuss beauty? Well, our subject is really pleasure, because remember, a couple of talks back, we began to analyze what happiness was, and I proposed that for the purpose of these talks, let's consider that there are two types of happiness. So I keep retracing my steps so that in case any of you may join this journey along the way, then you know what you may need to go back and revisit. And it's always a good idea to go back and start from the beginning, because this is a step-by-step process, a journey that I take you along with me. And it would always be beneficial if you have only just joined these talks to, when you find the time, go back and start from talk number 1, which was titled, Why Buddhism? So, in last week's talk, we were discussing the subject of beauty. And as I was saying, the purpose or the reason that we discussed this was because I proposed to you that there are two types of happiness. One, unconditional, meaning a happiness that is independent, that does not require the coming together of one or more factors. A happiness that is yours no matter what happens around you. Now, this is our goal. This is the end that we all seek. And this is the end that I will help you see, I will help you realize as we move forward. But before we get there, I need to help you realize the problem with the other kind of happiness, if there is a problem. Because I don't expect anyone to switch from one to the other unless there's a problem with what you already have. So, we are all familiar with a type of happiness. This is the kind of happiness that we have all been seeking and pursuing in our lives. And before I show you an alternative, I want you to consider if there's a problem with the happiness that we have all come to know and we know so well. And that is conditional happiness. This conditional happiness, for the purpose of these talks, I suggested that we refer to it as pleasure. And that is what got us this far. So, on the one hand, you have unconditional happiness, which is the ultimate aim, the ultimate goal of these talks, of this program, and we'll get to that eventually. But as we get there, we need to try and understand if there's anything fundamentally wrong with the happiness that we all know so well. And that is this conditional happiness, also known as pleasure. We have all experienced pleasure in our lives. It would not be fair to say that life is always an experience of pleasure. There's, of course, pain and pleasure, the ups and downs in life. But we always try to aim for pleasure, and we always try to drive ourselves away from pain. We don't like pain, we like pleasure. But somehow, circumstances in life, the vicissitudes of life seem to throw us back to pain from time to time. And then our quest has always been, how do we pick ourselves back up again and move across to pleasure? And then again, things happen, life happens, and you're back to pain. So, this project of life seems to be like a constant and never-ending exercise of moving from pain to pleasure. But more about that later. So that was probably a trailer of what's coming in perhaps 1 or 2 talks' time. But for now, pleasure. We all have experienced pleasure to more or less a degree, and we all like pleasure. So is there a problem with pleasure? Well, you see, the pleasure that we have all come to know and love so much is conditional. Meaning, there are things that have to line up. There are factors that need to come together, aggregate, for us to be able to experience this pleasure. Now, we know that much, and last week what we tried to understand was, are there different types of pleasure? So, if you remember, we talked about how we experience the world around us. We have our 5 senses. There is the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. Our 5 sense doors. And through our 5 sense doors, we sense what goes on around us. Through our 5 sense doors, we experience pleasure. So, we then began to analyze, how is it that we experience this pleasure? What is pleasure? What is the pleasure that we experience through the eye sense door? And we all know that when we experience pleasure through sight, which is what we use our eyes for, when we experience pleasure through sight, we refer to that as beauty. Right? That's when we say something's beautiful. So when do we say something's beautiful? We say something's beautiful when we see a sight and we wish to say that we find it pleasurable. A pleasurable sight is something we refer to as beauty. So that much we're all quite comfortable with. And then, in last week's talk, I took you one step further and I asked you to analyze, how is it that we find certain things beautiful? Why are some things beautiful to some and not so beautiful to others? Why do you find some things attractive and some things not so attractive? Why do others find the things that you don't find attractive, attractive? And why is it that the things that they find unattractive, you find attractive? How is that possible? If attractiveness or beautiful or beauty even is an aspect or a characteristic of the sight or the outside world object, by object, I don't only mean hard, solid things. It could be absolutely anything. It's how we refer to an object in physics, for instance. An object can be a physical object, solid, liquid or gas. To put it quite simply, it could be a person. So we find people beautiful, don't we? You find yourselves admiring some people and their beauty, and you say, that person's quite beautiful. He's quite handsome. She's very pretty. These are all words that we use to describe beauty. And what is beauty again? Beauty is what we experience. It is how we express the experience of pleasure when we see that sight. And we say that we find beauty in the world around us. So some of the examples we discussed last week were the sunset. People like watching the sunset. Some do, some don't. Works of art, drawings. Different people find different pieces of art beautiful. A flower. Some like daisies, others like daffodils. People. Some like Asian, others like Caucasian. Some like fair-skinned, others like dark-skinned. If you were to ask a group of people, let's take men for instance, and you show them ladies of different races, different facial characteristics, everyone's going to be unique unless of course they're identical twins, and you ask them to score how beautiful, how attractive they find the ladies that have been presented to them. Chances are that each one of them will have a different score for how beautiful they find the ladies. And why is that? Because if beauty is a characteristic of the person, then it should be the same no matter who the observer is. You've heard the expression, haven't you? Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. So if beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, where does it not lie? It does not lie in the object. Last week I suggested to you that if a particular characteristic of anything exists in the object, then we should have some way of measuring it. We took the example of a girl, and I could ask you, how much does she weigh? So let's ask 10 fine young men. We show them a girl that you find attractive, right? So we've got a specimen, and we have 10 young men looking at this girl, and we ask them, how much does she weigh? Well, the simplest way to answer that question would be to get a weighing scale. Would you get on that for us for a moment, please, dear? And you look at the reading, and everyone comes up with the same answer. She weighs this amount of kilos. Does anyone want to argue? Would anyone like to debate? No? Everyone's quite happy and content with that. If the weighing scale says that she weighs 65 kilos, then that's fine. That's what she weighs. No arguments, no debate, no questions. Okay, how tall is she? Let's ask this group of observers. How tall is she? Do us a favor, darling, and stand next to the wall. Now let's just mark where your head meets the wall. Now step aside for us, please. Let's get a measuring tape and measure the distance between that point and the floor. And let's say we get 1.2 meters. And now we ask, does anyone want to argue? Does anyone want to debate whether she's that tall, or if you think she's taller than 1.2 meters? Do you think she's shorter than 1.2 meters? Would you like to debate that? Would you like to argue what this measuring tape has shown us? No. No one in their sane mind would argue with that. So we have no problem there. You could take her temperature. You could even ask, what color do you think she is? What is her complexion? Is she dark or is she fair? What color is her hair? How long is her hair? Again, you could measure that. How thick is her hair? Again, you could measure that. See? You can measure these things, and you're not going to get anyone putting themselves forward to debate or argue any of these values because they are objective. In other words, these characteristics are present in the object. They are part and parcel of the object. The object itself is 1.2 meters. The object itself is 65 kilos. The object itself has a temperature of 96.9 degrees Celsius. These are all characteristics of the object. No matter how many times you measure it, you're going to get the same answer. No matter who measures it, you're going to get the same answer. To change these measurements, you have to change the object. Right? So you could ask the girl to step aside and ask someone else to step in. Now you could take those measurements again, and of course you're going to get different values. Now you ask that second participant to step aside again, and the first participant, the first girl, to step back into her place and take those measurements again, and it's going to be the same readings you got before. Why is that so? Because these are characteristics of the object. I'm probably making this simpler than it needs to be. I agree. But I'm doing it because I want you to completely and fully appreciate and understand this. Because eventually you will begin to realize that what you have so far and thus far in life sought in the objects around you were never really present in them. And therefore, your quest to find them in those objects has never been a fulfilling task. I want to save you the hassle. I want to save you from the trouble that you go through throughout your lives, trying to find the unseekable, trying to find something that does not exist in the outside world. Now, I dare not say that beauty does not exist. That is not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is beauty does not exist where you think it is. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. I have taken the example of a girl and how beautiful she looks. Are there any units to measure this beauty? You could ask someone, can you score how beautiful she is on a scale of 1 to 10? But what are the units? What are the units of beauty? The answer is, there aren't any. Because science does not agree. Science does not agree that beauty can be measured. Even science doesn't agree with that, let alone Buddhist philosophy. The only thing is, we never stop to question. We never stop to ponder these things. It never dawned upon us to try to stop, to take a moment to ask ourselves the question, hang on a second. I always thought she was beautiful, but really, is she beautiful, or do I just simply find her beautiful? See, I find her beautiful. It's not the her that I find. It's the beautiful that I find. She's there. And the same goes for sounds. Music. Different people have different tastes in music, don't they? Just think about the people you live with at home. You, your husband, your wife, your father, your mother, your son, your daughter, your brother, your sister, your grandparents, your colleagues, your friends, Do they all have the same taste in music? Absolutely everyone? Why not? Why do different people find different types of music pleasing to the ear? Why is beauty to the ear different from ear to ear? See, if there was one particular artist whose songs, whose music was so beautiful, why do we need so many artists? And besides, remember the other point that we discussed last week. I'm juggling your memory here. If something were actually beautiful, if beauty, or let's say in the case of music,